Welcome to the final episode of TEA's SATE Global Series. I'm Chuck Fawcett, and I'm president of the TEA International Board. We are so pleased to be able to use this new format for SATE to bring together our global membership to share stories, insights, and inspiration around the theme of reinvention. It's a theme our content curation team came up with more than a year ago, and I think it's going to be relevant for a long time to come. Today's episode 5 is a bonus episode that came together after we announced our initial program schedule. This keynote presentation continues a SATE tradition that began in 2014, the opportunity to have a deeper conversation with a leader from our industry. In the case of today's conversation, International Board member Evie Sari was inspired when she first met Joe Rohde. She pursued the idea of exploring a topic that is fundamental to the purpose of the TEA, engaging with complex audiences of different cultures from diverse geographies. What evolved from that is today's presentation entitled Where Asia Meets the West, Storytelling Without Borders. We are thrilled that Joe Rohde was intrigued enough with the concept to participate in this conversation with Evie. The discussion is a perfect finale for the SATE Global Series, as it embodies a truly global perspective that is made possible because of this new virtual format, connecting all of us around the world. Before we dive into the conversation, I want to thank you for joining us throughout the SATE Global Series. I hope you have gained new insight and inspiration to keep moving forward to a very bright future, a future that feels closer every day. On behalf of the TEA, I would like to thank all of our speakers and everyone who supported the creation and presentation of this first ever virtual SATE conference. I also want to thank all of our sponsors. You continue to be there for the TEA, and that is always so appreciated, but it is particularly valuable through a period such as the one we've just experienced over the last 18 months, a challenging time that we continue to emerge from. I hope you took a moment to watch the video message from our presenting sponsor, the Hedema Group, while you were in the lobby. If you haven't watched it yet, please take the time to do so before you leave us today. Now we're going to hear from our Episode 5 keynote sponsor, Jinma Rides.
Jinma Rides is very happy to be the sponsor of Episode 5 of TEA SATE Global Series. The conversation today is called Where Asia Meets the West, Storytelling Without Borders. This topic reflects the growth of the industry in Asia. Everything that cements projects brings together creative talents and ideas with the tools and techniques we know are required to create compelling places and experiences.
At Jinma Rides, our focus and tradition is to enable storytelling with our exclusively designed products and our collaborative process. We have been engaged in the success of world-class resorts in Shanghai and Beijing. The latter is preparing for its grand opening soon. We are able to help customers achieve IP-themed experience through careful planning and by the use of cutting-edge technologies, including digital virtual reality, real-time lifecycle risk control system, an IoT-based intelligent operations and maintenance platform, as well as other digital means to ensure that our projects are reliable and safe from R&D, manufacturer to the final operation.
We celebrate that the SATE Global Series is exploring new and different approaches that represent the best of storytelling, architecture, technology, and experience. Welcome to Episode 5 of TEA SATE Global Series.
Thank you, Jinma Rides. What a great message. I also want to add how excited we are that the TEA divisions have been starting to host in-person events around the world. This includes a return to in-person SATE conferences, with SATE Europe taking place at Portaventura in Spain later this fall. We hope that all of you who are able to travel safely will consider joining us in Spain, and I look forward to seeing you there. And now please welcome your SATE Global Episode 5 host, all the way from Shanghai. Please say hello to Mia Taitanen.
Hello everyone. I'm very happy to be joining you today as your host for Episode 5 of TEA's SATE Global Series. As Chuck mentioned, I'm based in Shanghai and I'm a Vice President of TEA's Asia Pacific Division Board. But that's all I'm going to talk about myself. We won't take up your valuable time by providing detailed instructions. Instead, you can find bios for our SATE global speakers within the in-event app. In a reminder to everyone that the link you were given to enter the SATE global series can be used anytime up to July 31, 2021. Episodes 1 through 4 are already available for replay. Today's presentation will be available after this episode airs. So, if you've missed an episode, or you want to watch something again, which I assume you'll do, simply click on the room with the episode number you are looking for once you're in the virtual lobby. As Chuck mentioned in his intro, the idea for this conversation with Joe Rohde came about when Evie Sari met Joe and started formulating an idea in her head to explore the idea of storytelling without borders. This is particularly important in the context of the massive industry growth in Asia. And as we move closer to being the world's biggest theme park and tourism market, this is especially true in China. The cultural renaissance here is having a direct and unprecedented impact on consumer trends. It's redefining what makes IP, what makes brands, and what makes content desirable. To succeed in the region, we entertainment professionals will need to be challenged more than ever to create story worlds that meet the language, value, and cultural expectations of local audiences. This discussion invites exploration. From broad differences to subtle variations in storytelling between the East and the West, to identify what can inspire emotional engagement in experiences that is universal across cultures, across disciplines, and over time. So, please join me in welcoming Evie Sari in conversation with Joe Rohde.
Hi, Joe. Thank you for joining us on this special episode. Today's keynote is the finale to the TA Global SATE series, a conversation with Joe Rohde, where Asia meets the West, storytelling without borders. So, Joe, to many of our TA members in the West, you need no introduction. Joe Rohde is many things. You're a sculptor, a painter, veteran Imagineer, Disney legend, expedition traveler, conservationist. But to make the SATE conversation more inclusive for us in the East, we hope to frame this conversation with an Asia lens, especially for audiences who are less familiar with who you are and the incredible work that you do. So Joel, as context for today's chat, to introduce you to our global audience, especially for audiences in China, we're very honored today to welcome Joe Rohde, Grandmaster of Transportive Storytelling and Placemaking. So in Chinese, we say 宗师 for Grandmaster. You're the 宗师 of storytelling in space. Joe, a common childhood you share with many of us here in Asia is that we didn't grow up going to Disney theme parks. You grew up in Hawaii and then you moved to California when you were 12 years old. So growing up in Hawaii, a place of such rich native culture, what was your earliest memory or most special memory of visiting a family amusement place as a child that still influences your work today?
Of course, growing up in Hawaii, I did not have direct access to Disneyland or anything like it. The places we visited when I was young were mainly natural places, places of nature that were within the island. Now, when I was very, very young indeed, we did go to Disneyland, but all I remember from being a very small child was being held in someone's arms, so I must have been very small, watching the Native Americans dancing at Tom Sawyer's Island. I remember that. Very, very distant memory. But many of my memories as a child mainly have to do with the experience of nature, of rivers, of jungles, of beaches. And these were the places I went for recreation.
Fantastic. So from that, you've done incredible work with Disney spanning 40 years. And the Hawaii Aulani Resort and Animal Kingdom are very unique legacies. Both probably represent your childhood connection, very connected to nature and wildlife, and very authentic to the cultures that they represent. So it's very different against the other Disneyland parks, especially the ones we have here in Asia, right? In Tokyo, in Hong Kong, and in Shanghai, they all have magic castles and famous IP. So was the process of designing for non-castle and non-IP based parks and resorts very different to the ones with classic IP?
In some ways, yes, the process is quite different because without intellectual property, you have to start the story structure earlier. Intellectual property brings with it some structure, which other storytellers have already invested in. They already made that structure. And so you're starting from that point and going forward. What we had to do was to look into the subject of animals, the subject of Hawaii, and find a structure to begin at zero and build up the story from really nothing. And yet make sure when we were done, we had a very strong backbone for the story to live on. And because of that, we have more focus on, I would call it, intellectual aspects of story construction, analysis, research, conversation, and negotiation, because we're starting without the basis of a story that someone has already created.
And it's much harder, you think, Joe?
Every form of storytelling brings challenges that are unique to it. We had advantages in that the world we were representing was real. And so we could rely on real materials. We could rely on real cultural artifacts, real people. Whereas if you're creating a fantasy, almost everything you touch has to be custom created. That actually limits the number of things you can do. So there are pros and cons in this. I think the difference has more to do with where do you place your energy? Where is the energy going? And for us, a lot of energy has to go to research, analysis, negotiation, to make sure that if we're telling a story that seems to be true, it can be traced back to something true.
Understood. So the energy for storytelling is different when you're working on an IP and a non-IP park. And so the story format can also be very different. So when I first joined themed entertainment from the film industry, Joe, a theme park veteran told me that designing parks is just like designing for film. Only instead of telling the story through the camera lens, we tell the story through what the guest sees. But you've spoken before as well about how stories for placemaking is very different to the film format, and different to how we read stories in books. In your words, you say telling stories in physical places is more about creating a sense of the story, built from ideas and impressions, which then compose the story. So, is storytelling for physical experiences more about composing scenes around a central theme with no clear beginning, middle, and end?
When you are designing in a place, you do not have the same linear control. The control of sequence is less than in film or in a book, where the director or the storyteller has absolute 100% control, frame by frame, page by page, word by word, image by image, absolute control. And the viewer, the person who is experiencing the story, tends to be in one place. I sit to read the book, I sit to observe the film. So I have extremely high guarantee about where the viewer is and therefore what the viewer will see when I am working in these forms. But when you're moving through space freely, even if I have arranged a sequence, I don't know that you're walking in the same direction. I don't know where you're looking. So the difference is instead of relying on the sequence as the frame for the story, instead, what you do is you dissect the story, and I don't mean the plot of the story. You dissect the ideas. What does the story mean to say? What emotion does it mean to convey? What idea do I want you to come away with? And you plant these emotions and ideas all around the environment so that it is very difficult to move through this environment without encountering the idea behind the story. But you are building the story yourself as you move. So as you walk or move through a narrative, a storytelling place, as you move through that space, you are creating a sequence, but it belongs to you. My job is to make sure that no matter what sequence you construct, you encounter the emotions and the ideas which I intend to convey.
Understood. So you leave clues as designer within the space for the visitor to arrange it in narrative according to their experience of it.
In some cases, it is a clue. I would consider a clue to be an intellectual element, something that I understand when I see it. But there are also ways to embed the feeling. For example, one of our projects, Expedition Everest, is set in the Himalayas. And it proposes to be a Himalayan village adjacent to a big mountain, and it proposes a story about the Yeti as the defender of the distant spaces of this mountain. Now, the village appears to be authentic, but it is also very, very deliberately chosen to echo that mountain. The particular stone, the jaggedness of the stone, the roughness of the village is embedded in the village itself. You cannot look at the village without also thinking about the stone of the mountain. So they have been made to rhyme. So sometimes it's not a clue, it's a rhyme between two objects that are made to rhyme. They rhyme with each other, and that way they rhyme with the main idea. And by doing this, instead of thinking like a line, you think like a cluster, like a three-dimensional cluster of objects and ideas that come together, no matter how you touch them, to make an impression.
Understood. So you've been to Asia a lot, Joe. So you're familiar with the stories and as in Asia, especially in Southeast Asia, uh, many of the stories that inspire us or mine for attraction placemaking are from epic literature, such as the ancient Ramayana with Hanuman, the monkey god. We also have Journey to the West with Monkey King, written 400 years ago, but still much beloved today. So, but in China, especially despite their popularity, the Monkey King has been adapted into films, animation, TV, manga, and of course now theme parks. But there's been very little success with adapting historical fiction for theme parks because they're very complex. They've got very intricate plots and huge cast of characters. So we've talked about making intellectual and rhyming in terms of clues or impressions for the guest. But what about characters? What is the role of characters in stories for placemaking? Can myths and legends, especially the ones from the East, work as original IP for theme parks? Or does it always have to become a film or an animation IP first?
I believe that all stories that work because of deep internal structure, deep meaning, and for the most part, meaning that I think does cross cultural boundaries. But very often we are distracted by or hypnotized by the superficial external part of the story. Details of a character, details of a plot, details of a setting, rather than the deepest idea. I do believe that myth, legend, cultural stories can be made into the experience of place. But very often it involves a kind of translation. And when I was working for a while with Marvel, and what I used to say to my team in that case was the character of the character is the character of the place. That's two uses of the word character. In one sense, we mean the innate condition, the mentality, the spiritual condition of the character must become the condition of the place. So that instead of waiting for the character, who may or may not appear, and I don't know when, and I may not know how, until I get on a ride, right? A ride is linear, and you can use the same sorts of storytelling mechanisms within a ride. But in a place, what I have to do is decide, number one, what is the character of the story? What is the meaning of the story, the feeling of the story? Put that everywhere. And then the character, I don't mean clues about things that happened to the character. I mean as if the character had been turned into a building, turned into a tree, turned into a bench. What kind of bench is that? What kind of tree is that? So that I cannot look or be in the place without sensing the underlying meaning of this event and the characters who partake in it. So it is not, I would say, accurate in the sense of being just like it was real. It's not. It has been deliberately distorted to push emotional ideas, to push meaning, so that you sense the feeling of what this must be about before you know what it's about. And this way, you don't need to rely on the details of the story. They may be there, they may not be there, only some of them may be there. But the spirit of the story is in every single object and every treatment of every object in the place.
Hmm. The process sounds very analytical, Joe, and it sounds like it's a very sort of driven, very very conscientious effort to find the true character of the character. Um, but in ideating stories for location-based entertainment in our industry, it's very limiting, and sometimes I feel like it doesn't allow for that very rich process that you just described about how to tell stories in placemaking. We always start with a brainstorm, as you know, and we have a number of problems to solve, like what is the character of the story, what theme should we use, and we discuss it in a big group of people in a limited time. That I don't know how that will allow for that kind of rich process that you've just spoken about, because from that we'll end up with a list of ideas and gets developed into the concept. So how do you make sure that ideas are not limited to the knowledge in the room, Joe? Like, how do you manage creativity in groups to reach the maximum potential that you just spoke about? How we create the richness of the place that is based on very intellectual connections with the story you're trying to tell?
There's a couple answers to this question. I'm going to start with one. I would start with a small room with a few people and a long time. So if you handed me a box with money and I could use this money to pay for people and time, I would have fewer people and more time and spend the same amount of money. Number one, because I'm starting from story structure itself, not any superficial expression of it at all. No idea for a ride, no idea for a restaurant, no idea for anything, nothing. Only the inner idea of what it is about. That just takes a small number of people, and you want to make sure that you have multiple points of view in that small group. Once you have created a proposal, I want to be clear, this is a proposal. We believe that this story is about this idea. Then you grow the group by another ring of people, and you test to see, does this proposal have validity? Does it attract people? Does it create ideas? And all through this, there is usually, if you're doing this right, very active debate, not simply agreement, not consensus, but debate. And as you debate, you are testing the validity of what you said at the beginning, usually strengthening the good parts, moving the bad parts. And then it gets stronger. You can add a few more people. So I grow very slowly. And only after the idea is very clear, and after we have made like a thesis of how we would know that it is true, then we would say, what kind of ride does this sound like? Does this sound fast? Does this sound slow? Does this ride even need to have any surprise in it at all? It clarifies your ability to decide what should and should not be involved if you deeply understand what is the story. When I say the story, I don't mean the plot. I mean the core idea. What is it we are trying to say? Why do we say that? How would I know it? If I could use an example from Disney's Animal Kingdom, I know many people have not been to Disney's Animal Kingdom. But if you think about one of its core values is the absolute value of nature, that nature is supreme. Nature cannot be traded upon. Nature is an absolute value. And we claim that this is expressed by a set of rules. The dominance of landscape over architecture, the dominance of texture over smoothness, the dominance of asymmetry over symmetry. So in theory, you should be able to look at these details, an asymmetrical textured object, and you should be able to guess that that object must have more to do with nature than it might have to do with technology. Once that's done, then you can say to yourself, if all of that is true, and I want to have a ride, is that ride more likely to be smooth or rough? It sounds like it should be rough. It just does, right? If I'm in a place about the intrinsic value of nature, in which trees are asymmetrical and walls are textural and fence posts are irregular, and I have a vehicle that moves in such a space, does it move smoothly or does it bounce and jiggle? So this is how you're building up so that each subsequent detail already rhymes with the details that come before. And yet you may not know what those details are going to be. You only know that they are going to rhyme.
So you set parameters and rules for what can actually go into the place that accentuates the inner idea of the story. Yeah.
Much more important than any plot, even plot itself. The plot becomes a way of expressing the inner values. So you may manipulate the plot. Let's say I was dealing with an intellectual property. I worked on Avatar. The actual movie Avatar is an adventure love story. It's an action war movie. It has all kinds of elements that make it a very popular movie. But those are not relevant to Disney's Animal Kingdom. And we did not use them, and we did not refer to them. They're not there. Instead, we took the entirety of that film and started from Animal Kingdom. What are the values of Animal Kingdom? The intrinsic value of nature, this notion of adventure as a psychological transformation. And then we used it like a filter. So out of all of what Avatar might be, what things must it be if it is going to be at Animal Kingdom? And that leads us to some very surprising interpretations, surprising conclusions. And in fact, our goal in the end was not to replicate the film at all, but to build another world like the film where things could happen like the film, but not what happened in the film. The things that happen in this world are specific to the story we intend to tell. So it is intellectual property, the intellectual property of the film Avatar, but it is not the plot, nor the characters, nor even the specific set of the movie Avatar. Only the idea behind the movie re-expressed in new forms.
Wow. So it's like a original re-expression of the film for the theme park then, not that we imagine it to be where you actually just lift the film onto placemaking.
Right. You
Hmm.
re-express it. And part of the reason for this is that it's a very different medium. And so the power of film has to do partly with acting, which we don't get very much of, partly to do with visual composition on a two-dimensional surface. The screen may appear to be three-dimensional, but what makes it successful is composition on the two-dimensional surface of that screen. There is no two-dimensional surface in a place. It's all actually dimensional. And so to compose for that is very different than the rules you might use in a film. And so this is why it is generally more effective to re-express the idea, not to simply reflect it, but to digest it and to re-express it as a dimensional experience experienced by the people who are going through the environment, rather than people simply passively rewatching the experience of those same others who they saw in a film.
Fascinating. I think that really encouraged people who watch this to watch the movie again and then to, really go to the place and understand the kind of physical and re-expression of the film that you mentioned. But Animal Kingdom is very famous, Joe. It's fantastic that you worked on it. But when in my research, I actually found that many articles about your work reference a lesser known project in Asia, which is the Adventurers Club. It's a show that you created that ran for 19 years. And then I saw that many fans and industry insiders in America wrote that it had the best original storylines, and it continues to influence Disney attractions today. So unlike Animal Kingdom, which we still get to see and study, and learn about the storytelling methods that you practiced for it. For our Asian audiences who will never get to visit the Adventurers Club, can you please tell us what it was and what was so special about the storytelling that made it so successful?
I believe that the Adventurers Club was partially successful because of when it happened. What the Adventurers Club was a immersive improv theater. It was styled to appear to be an adventurers club from that great era of adventure, basically a colonial fantasy. But it was actually a very ironic, satirical deconstruction of that colonial fantasy. So all the adventurers who you actually met in this adventurers club were oddly flawed, incompetent, not necessarily good at what they did. There was this soap opera of relationships between all these adventurers. So this is part of what made it interesting, rather than aggrandizing adventure as an unreachable state that you could never become. We're pulling it back towards you so you can feel more involved. So this was part one. Part two was the nature of the theater itself, which was about half scripted and half improvisational. We knew that almost everybody coming to this club was going to come from a theme park. So they would bring expectation from the theme park. And one of the things they would bring from that expectation is 100% scripted. There's very little improvisation, especially 35 years ago in a theme park. Another expectation they would bring is if something on the wall moves, that thing is a robotic audio animatronic thing. It does the same thing over and over again. It repeats. That's my expectation. I have expectations about the level of humor. It's going to be for children. None of these things turn out to be true in the Adventurers Club. The objects on the wall, which appear to be robotic audio animatronic things, are all puppets. They're all puppeted. The walls of the club were hollow. So the actors, who also were free to improvise, could sit with you, have a real conversation with you about your upcoming wedding, talk to you about your girlfriend, talk to you about your workday. They could interview you basically in the character of who they were. 3 minutes later, they're inside that wall, inside that hollow wall, operating some puppet of a sculpted stone head that magically already knows your name, can talk to you, can see you. It's like over here, it's like I'm having a real conversation for real with this sculpted stone head on a wall. It's very much like what we did many years later with living characters, like Crush. But this was early improvisational puppeted. There was no technology. I used to sit there because back in the old days, no one recognized me. So I could sit in this club and listen to people talk. It was very interesting because the way they imagined that we were doing this was actually the way things have turned out to be. But none of that existed right now. They would think there must be a computer that recognizes how we're talking. There must be a remote location. None of that was true. It's literally a guy in the wall with his hand in the thing, working it like a puppet. So that's the next thing. Very unexpected. And then I think one of the things about the Adventurers Club that people very much mistake is they think about the adventure of the Adventurers Club because of all the props, almost all of which were real. They were not, they were real. If it looked like a bow and arrow from the tribesmen of the Philippines, that's what it was. If it looked like a statue from India, it probably was. But that's not what made people love it. It was the club part of the Adventurers Club that it very much welcomed people in. It made them part of the story, recognized them, talked to them. It raised them up. It made them equal, made them, instead of we're great adventurers and you get to be here, it was like, no. We're kind of all here as adventurers and we're actually not that great. So it's very uplifting to the sense of self to be there. People felt included, they felt respected, they felt seen. And this is why they came again and again and again to this strange place that, for an improv theater show, 20 years, 19 years, pretty good run. I don't have any regrets about the fact that it ultimately closed. A 19-year run is an awfully good run for basically an improv theater bar.
It's immersive theater 35 years before. Now it's like very popular here in China too. It has all the principles of storytelling back then already. But I'm fascinated, Joe. I try to find a lot of pictures of it. I think the authentic, what do you call it, the hyper realism of the place is very, very convincing and fantastic. I know that you source a lot of the environmental sets and props yourself. But I love to hear your thoughts about language in storytelling, because you mentioned irony, satire, and humor, right? And so, and you've said yourself, like for placemaking, does this use of story impressions, does it change when we move from one language to another, or one sense of cultural space to another? I would ask, like, if you were to create the Adventurers Club in Shanghai, how will you think differently about creating the characters and the backstory? So other than consulting subject matter experts, which is what we do in our industry, if a designer has to create a story that's so rich, like what you described for Adventurers Club, for users from a different culture and a different language, what advice do you have for that foreign storyteller to avoid cultural bias and to deliver a story world that still feels very cultural authentic to local users?
That is a very good question, because there are aspects, for example, of the Adventurers Club that were we to do it today, we would not do the same thing, because they were culturally of an age in which now I just think it would be a little more insensitive. Some portrayals, some scripting, you wouldn't do this. So number one, no matter where you are, let's say we're building in Shanghai, you need to stimulate curiosity. You can't get people to engage if they think they already know what they are going to see, because your brain just won't let you do it. It will make you not pay attention if you think you know what you're going to see. So you have to have an element of surprise. You have to have an element of almost disconnect, like, wait a minute, this is not what I expect. In the case of the Adventurers Club, for example, the architecture of the Adventurers Club was very classical, very clean, very noble. The objects were out of this world, and they didn't match. It didn't match. The building itself did not match the way these artifacts worked inside of it. There's a question. So a question will help you to engage, number one. So you have to have a question, a way to get in to engage. Let's say we were still going to handle the question of adventure. I think as soon as you leave the Western European and American context, the entire category of meaning of adventure has to be rethought, right? What era are we talking about? Are we talking about Chinese adventurers? Are we talking about Western adventurers in China? There are a lot of things that you got to figure out. And that leads you to, if that's what we're talking about, this is our attitude. This is our stance that we're going to take. Like, it could be really interesting to do a deconstructed satirical take on this idea in such a context, or of the great 1930s, fantasy of Shanghai that really could use some deconstruction. And then you especially for immersive environments, and the Adventurers Club did this very carefully, you have to allow people the room to self-select depth of involvement. How close do I want you to come? How do I want you to talk to me? Do I want to stand up and do something? Because some people don't. They enjoy to be there, but they really do still want to just watch. They want to be in the immersive environment. They want to be immersed. They don't want a person to come up and start talking to them and try to pull them in. So you have to be sensitive to people's boundaries, so that the way we did this was by having, first there was a balcony level where nothing ever happened. You could stay up there and you would be safe. No one's going to come up and make you be in a story. Then we had the big room where big stories happened. Big events would happen, and you would be in the room and things are happening, but somebody might talk to you. But if you go in the little rooms, somebody might ask you to get up and do something. So you can kind of select where you want to be. And this helps people find where they belong in the immersive environment. All of this far, far before you get to some detail of what a wall should look like, or does it have spears or not? Is what does it mean to be in the space and relate humanly to the space, so that I can find a place for myself, find where's my place in this place. And that often, especially designers, can become over convinced of their own preference in a place. and remove opportunity for others by making it too forceful in a single idea.
It's fascinating. So, Joe, you talked a lot about immersive experiences and human connections, and how now like the guests can actually choose the level of connection that they want to the story, right? But nowadays, moving from the physical to the digital world that we're in, when we say immersive experiences, we actually now refer to layered reality. So, for example, moving from Adventures Club is something that's more recent that you've done. Flight of Passage is the world's greatest hybrid story world experience. When put on a headset, we're on a banshee, we're soaring over a fantastic imagery of Pandora. How has storytelling for attractions changed with the rise of technology and since you've done Adventurers Club? Is virtual reality the answer to unlocking the full potential of storytelling when we say immersive experiences now? Where do you see that going in the future?
I think there is a challenge with immersive technology, which we experienced with Flight of Passage. And Flight of Passage is 3D glasses, but it is a completely immersive dome. And it oddly flirts with the sense of being a headset world because it is so immersive. As you increase detail, which is what this does, you're adding tremendously more factors to the world. This is increasing your obligation as a director to make those details rhyme, to make them matter. So it gets harder to do the world building because you cannot have arbitrary objects in a narrative world. The only objects in a narrative world are purposeful narrative objects. When you start creating hyper real, densely packed visual worlds, you are fantastically increasing the burden of direction. And if you don't increase the burden of direction, you end up with a world that may look real, but it does not have the power of narrative, which comes from cohesion, from rhyme structure, from clarity. These things are artificial. This is how I know that it's a narrative world, is that it surpasses the real world. Virtual reality is still a little bit in an adolescent stage of being obsessed with accuracy and depiction, and eventually will reach a point where it is about pure expression, which I will consider to be a mature phase. So to me, number one, it's this burden of detail that you must address in order to maintain the narrative environment. That is a thing. The other aspect has to do with solving the question of communal experience, successful avatars, successful representations of the others who are in the space that have some emotive relative power, because very rarely in our world do you do things alone. You do them in groups, you do them with people, you do them with friends, you do them with family. And as soon as you get to the headset level of experience, it's difficult to cross-relate to something that is sophisticated, right? We can see that there's a body over there next to mine, but so far not sophisticated. And I think that is a thing to be addressed. I don't believe that virtual experience will replace physical experience. I actually believe there's a lot of reasons for this. The haptic body sense of things that are really happening is very, very different from the visual representation of them. We've been talking about this through the whole interview, right? Even something as simple as optical information. You may or may not know this, but the visual cortex of your brain, which is where you form a picture of what is happening, yes, it's true that that receives information from your eyes, but it also receives information from your skin, from your gut, from your ears. So the world that you are constructing that you think is a visual world is actually being built up out of all kinds of other body sensations that are not optical. They're not visual. But once you take that world and turn it into a two-dimensional picture, now it did become only optical. It's the very same, if you were in the same room as me right now, looking at me talking with your eyes, that experience of seeing me is not the same as seeing me on the screen where you see me right now, because I am only optical information right now. None of the other signals from which your brain would build a picture of me, they're not there, just the optical information. So the challenge of data richness in virtual experience, data accuracy, the challenge of allowing people to see what their brains say is there, which all of us do differently. Imagine this. This is very weird. We're all building the world in our head, but a virtual world has already been built in someone else's head. So there's a reductive quality there that would be interesting to challenge in future work.
What happens if it's a mixed reality? Like you construct the visual world, but it's multi-sensory with auditorial senses and smells. Is that a richer creation of
I
this
mean,
fantasy
it can
world?
be, yes. And we definitely know that you can be led, right? We've already seen from work that's been done, you can be led to believe a lot of things are going on. Your body is full of memory of physical experience that can be stimulated through virtual signals, haptic signals, sound signals. It's all absolutely possible. What interests me the most would be, I'm not sure how this could ever really be done, but a virtual world that mimicked the way the optical world is seen, which is it's only in focus where you look at it, right? Like, I don't know how much you know about this. Like, if I hold my hands out here like this, I'm completely convinced that I can see my hands, but that's really not physically possible. There is no optical accuracy to that part of my range of vision. I can't see color. I think I see motion. I'm making up my hands right now. I'm making up an image of my hands that I believe I see right now. So it's not my real hands. It's a made up image. If I could create a virtual world where that was possible, who knows, people would be then enriching that world with what they imagined the peripheral things to be as they moved through a world that was more like the world we actually see with our eyes, which is a world we're actually building with our mind and imagination.
Because our brain will fill in the space to create that world in our heads, right?
That's right.
Wow.
It's going to make something up because it does not like a blank.
Hmm. So, well, we've spoken a lot about technology, Joe. You have your concerns, and we have a lot of expectations for what's future to come when our brain can when it can be rich enough to tell the stories in our mind for our brain to connect to. So speaking of technology, audiences around the world have seen the incredible footage, even here in China, of Virgin Galactic completing its first space flight from New Mexico. So, what is that relationship between storytelling and space, Joe? Like, with all of this technology that we have right now, what does space mean to you? And what is that universal, still human element of space travel that moves us, do you think?
It's a really interesting question. And of course, one of the questions that we're talking about right now. The most important thing, I think, with what I'm doing with Virgin Galactic does have to do with the humanity of the whole thing, the human experience. It's not the question of spaceflight as a technical achievement. 10 years from now, there's just going to be tons of that. It is an incredible engineering achievement. The question is, what is the human meaning of this? What can we make it mean? What do we want it to mean? who is coming, who is going to do this, and what does it already mean to them? So a lot of the work that I will be doing and am doing has much more to do with humanism and meaning and constructing meaning around this event and making sure that if you're going to invest a part of your life in this great adventure, that you come away from it with a strong sense of value, right? This is a rare time in history. It won't be forever. Someday people will go into space all the time. That's not now. Now is this rare time when people can do this for a generation, maybe. And it will be extraordinary and rare, and they'll notice it in the way that the first people who sailed across the ocean, like, really knew they were doing something, you know? So I think it's a rare time to be involved. That's part of what's attractive to me. The moment is interesting. And I do believe a very, very human time for space travel.
So, Joe, we're going to come back full circle. You spoke about your childhood in Hawaii when you grew up in very natural environments, and hence you are very aware and conscious about your conservation efforts. So, can you talk to us about using your artistic talent to not just move us to space, but to protect animals? For example, you've been raising funds for snow leopard conservation. How did that come about, and what are your hopes and dreams for the conservation work that you do?
So it's interesting. I'm in the Explorers Club, which is a club based in New York City, has chapters all over the world. I'm a very minor member of the Explorers Club, very proud to be included in such a group of people. But this is particularly what interests me. I am an artist. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a biologist. I have no credentials, not a politician. I am an artist. And so sometimes I think people have the impression that this job of advocating for the planet, of taking action on behalf of nature, this is a job that has to be done by other people because they have credentials. Oh, he's a scientist, he's a politician, he's a journalist, she's a researcher. They know what they're doing, they can do it. But what I do believe is you can do what you were going to do anyway and just bend it. And suddenly it becomes advocacy. It becomes activism. I'm a painter. I'm going to paint. I like to paint. I could paint in such a way that it draws attention and value to snow leopard conservation. I could do it again in Guatemala and call attention to primate conservation. I'm an artist. I can do that. Somebody else is a writer, they can do that. Someone else is a musician, they could do that. There are people from all kinds of walks of life who, if they just thought for a second, how can I do what it is that I do anyway, in such a way that I add value to the challenges of the planet? That's really all it is. It's not more special than that. I'm an artist. I'm going to make art. Why not do that in a way that adds value, just as anybody could who thought it through and figured out how they might be able to do that?
So, as theme park designers and attraction designers, Joe, is there anything that we can do in our work to add value to the nature conservation work if we want to care about it as well as normal people?
You know, you can always, in the back of your mind, be aware. Awareness, self-awareness, and world awareness. Our work pulls us in and pulls us to these such focused effort that you can in fact lose sight of even why you're doing the work, right? It's got work, got to get this work done. Mindfulness, just to step back a second to think, is there a way we can touch that idea? Just touch that idea with a thing. Is there a thing we could do that would help somebody? You know, can I shunt this work to someone who needs the work? What can I do? So just self-awareness and world awareness while you do the work. And you can't do it every day. You can't. The work is super, super demanding, but you come up for air. You really should come up for air. I mean, you really should. Creative people need to separate themselves from the work sometimes in order to see it and judge it and know it and then dive back in again. If you just stay on it, you're going to lose sight of it and you can get lost in the work. And it gets done, but it doesn't ring, doesn't sing.
So my last question, Joe, like you talked about refreshing yourself and having a worldview and connecting again and being a little bit removed to the work that you do and have a worldview. So talking about worldview and world travels, where do you want to go after the pandemic is over? Where would your next expedition take you to? Do you have plans?
So I do have plans. I am a member of an expedition that is hopefully departing for the northern reaches of Baffin Island, which is way up north in Canada by northern Greenland, where I would be hopefully in mid-August for an expedition that is a conservation expedition related to narwhals, which are those whales with the long tusk. So that is supposed to happen. COVID permitting, that's supposed to happen. That will be fun.
What about Asia, Joe? Like China? You've
Love it.
traveled to China?
I have been through parts of China, not as much of China as there is to see by any means. Some years ago, I spent some time in the mountainous parts of Sichuan. That's probably my interesting experience within China was that region. There's a lot of China to see. I mean, that is a vast territory. Next year is my 40th anniversary. My wife wants to go to Africa, so I'm going to Africa because that's where she wants to go. So we'll do that, and then we'll see what comes after that.
Oh, fantastic. Is there anything else you want our Global City audiences to know, Joe, that we need to discuss and you want to add on to?
I would only say, when people hear that you work in this industry of themed design, theme parks, rides, and attractions, there's a way that they can think of this as being trivial work, entertainment, simple, lighthearted, not worthy of the term art. People who paint paintings that go in galleries, those are artists. People who make movies are a kind of artist. These people are not artists. This is not art. And I think that if you do not treat it like art, then that's true. But if you do treat it like art, if you treat it with the seriousness and the dedication and the study and the intensity and, frankly, the intellectualism that it deserves, that makes it art. And you should stand up and say so.
I think what really inspires me, Joe, is your very sincere efforts in your work to tap into the cultural richness and the humanity that moves us. So it's what art does, and universal art moves us in a way that does that because it reaches to your human emotions and the cultural DNA of who you are that defines you. So that inspires me. So we wish you all the best for your new adventures, Joe, and we hope to have another conversation with you in person, hopefully in a state, in a city somewhere in the world, ideally in China, very soon. And thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Evie, for having me. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Evie. My mind is full, and I'm sure everybody else's as well. We have been watching the chat during our conversation and have seen some great questions and discussions. When we start our live Q&A, please continue to submit your questions through the chat, and I will ask as many as I can of Joe and Evie. This brings us to the close of our formal TEA SATE Global Episode 5 today, and simultaneously marks the end of TEA SATE Global Series. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to our talented speakers, and thank you to everyone who has supported the creation and the presentations of this first ever virtual SATE conference for TEA. Please let me remind you that all of the episodes will now be available. You can watch them using the same link you used to enter our virtual environment today. That link will be active only until July 31, so be quick. I will be back, live and in person, with Evie and Joe for what I'm sure will be a very lively discussion. Please refresh your beverage and join me soon.
you.